She didn't stay in her 120. She didn't stay in her relationship because she was happy. She stayed because leaving felt impossible. Not in a logical way, not in a way she could explain to others, but in a way she could feel deeply, like something inside her tightened every time she even thought about walking away. Even when things weren't right, even when she knew it, even when a part of her quietly whispered, "This isn't what you really want." She still stayed, because the idea of being alone felt heavier than the weight of staying in something that was slowly draining her. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, a quiet fear, but constant. She told me once, after a long pause, "I'd rather be in something that doesn't work than in nothing at all." And she didn't say it like a joke. She said it like a truth she had accepted a long time ago, a rule she didn't remember creating, but kept living anyway. And that sentence, it didn't just explain her relationship, it explained her pattern, because this wasn't the first time, or the second. It was something she had done before, staying longer than she should have, holding on tighter than she needed to, choosing presence over peace. From the outside, it looked like loyalty, like commitment, like someone who didn't give up easily. But on the inside, it felt very different. It felt like survival, like she was holding on to something, not because it made her happy, but because letting go felt like falling into something unknown. And what scared her wasn't the relationship ending. It was what came after, the silence, the empty space, the absence of someone else's presence. Because for her, being alone didn't feel calm. It didn't feel peaceful. It didn't feel freeing. It felt like something was missing. Like the ground beneath her wasn't as stable. Like she had to face something she had been avoiding for a long time. So she stayed. Not because she didn't see the problems, not because she didn't understand what wasn't working, but because the alternative felt harder, felt heavier, felt unbearable. And when someone reaches that point, they don't choose the relationship. They choose the feeling that protects them from. Part 1. When being alone feels like a void. Clara was 35. On the surface, she had everything together. She was intelligent, capable, independent in so many areas of her life. She could make decisions, handle responsibilities, show up for others without hesitation. But when it came to relationships, something shifted, something softer, more fragile. Ending a relationship didn't just feel difficult, it felt overwhelming. Not because of the other person, not because she depended on them in obvious ways, but because of what followed after they were gone. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind you enjoy after a long day, but a silence that felt heavy. It filled the room in a way she couldn't ignore. Absence. No messages, no presence, no one to share small moments with, and then the empty space. A space she didn't quite know how to sit with. At first, she thought it was just loneliness, that simple, familiar feeling everyone talks about. But the more she paid attention, the more she realized it was something deeper, because loneliness comes and goes. It softens. It fades when you distract yourself. But this stayed. It lingered. It stretched into her evenings, into quiet mornings, into those moments when nothing was happening. It felt like she was standing at the edge of something undefined, like there was a gap she couldn't see the bottom of. And every time she got close to it, she pulled back, quickly, almost automatically. So instead of facing that space, she filled it with conversations, with the company, with relationships that gave her something to hold on to, even if those relationships weren't right, even if they didn't truly fulfill her, because for her, something was still better than nothing. And being with someone, even in something imperfect, felt safer than being alone with that emptiness. So she avoided it, not consciously, not deliberately, but in small, repeated choices, choosing connection over clarity, presence over peace, noise over silence, because silence, for her, wasn't neutral. It felt like a void. Part 2, the difference between loneliness and fear. At one point, I asked her a simple question. What do you actually imagine when you think about being alone? She didn't answer right away. She paused. Not because the question was hard to understand, but because the answer wasn't something she had clearly put into words before. Most people, when they think about being alone, might imagine rest, quiet, freedom, time to reset. But that's not what came up for her. What she described was something else entirely. Long evenings that felt endless, a kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but pressing. Moments where time seemed to slow down, and every minute felt longer than it should. She talked about sitting in a room with nothing urgent to do, and feeling uncomfortable in her own presence. Not in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, persistent way, like something just didn't feel right. She said, "It's like I become too aware of everything. Her thoughts, her emotions, her body, even the smallest thing felt amplified. And that's when it became clear. What she feared wasn't loneliness, it was exposure. Because loneliness is about missing someone. It's about wanting connection, but what she was describing was something deeper. It wasn't the absence of another person that disturbed her. It was the presence of herself without distraction, without something external to focus on, without something to soften what was happening inside. Because when nothing outside is demanding attention, everything inside gets louder. Thoughts you didn't notice before start repeating. Emotions you pushed aside start surfacing. Questions you avoided start asking themselves again. And if you're not used to sitting with that, it doesn't feel calm. It feels overwhelming. For Clara, that internal space wasn't familiar territory. It wasn't somewhere she had learned to navigate. So instead of feeling like freedom, it felt like losing control, like being unanchored, like drifting without something to hold on to. And the mind doesn't like that feeling. It wants stability. It wants something predictable, something it can organize itself around. That's why she reached for connection, not always consciously, but consistently. Because another person gave her something to orient herself toward, something to respond to, something to think about that wasn't her own internal world. It gave her direction, even if that direction wasn't always healthy, even if it came with a compromise, even if it meant ignoring certain truths. It still felt easier than facing that open, undefined internal space alone. And over time, her brain started to make a connection. Aloneness equals discomfort. Discomfort equals something is wrong. So naturally, it tried to avoid it. Not by thinking it through, but by reacting. By pulling her toward situations where she wouldn't have to feel it, toward people, toward relationships, toward anything that filled the silence. And that's how fear can disguise itself. Because from the outside, it can look like a desire for connection, like someone who just enjoys being in a relationship, like someone who values closeness, but internally, it's driven by something else. A need to not feel what comes up in stillness, a need to stay just busy enough, just connected enough to not have to face what's underneath. And the tricky part is, this doesn't feel like fear. It feels like a preference. I just don't like being alone. I function better with someone. I'm just more comfortable in a relationship. And while those statements can be true, sometimes they're also protective, because if she looked closer, if she slowed down enough to really observe it, she might notice something important. It wasn't that being alone was inherently painful. It was that being alone removed the buffer. And without that buffer, she came face to face with parts of herself she didn't yet know how to sit with. And until that changes, being alone won't feel like peace. It will feel like pressure. Part 3. When relationships become emotional anchors. For Clara, relationships weren't just about connection. They weren't just about love or companionship or sharing life with someone. They had a deeper function, something less visible, but much more important to her internal world. They were stabilizing. They gave her something to hold on to, a sense of direction, a kind of emotional structure that she didn't always feel on her own. When she was in a relationship, her days had a rhythm. There were messages to reply to, plans to think about, conversations to revisit in her mind, even small interactions, a good morning text, and a short call, a simple check-in. They created continuity, a sense that something was there, something consistent, something that connected one moment to the next. And that continuity mattered more than she realized, because without it, everything felt more open, too open, like her day didn't have clear edges, like her thoughts didn't have a place to land. And that openness didn't feel freeing. It felt unsafe, not in a physical way, but in an emotional, internal way, like she was floating without anything grounding her. So relationships became that ground, not perfect, not always fulfilling, but steady enough, predictable enough, present enough. And because of that, they started to serve a role beyond connection. They became anchors, something she could attach to, so she didn't have to drift. And when a relationship wasn't going well, when things felt off or distant or misaligned, she didn't immediately think, "This isn't right for me." Instead, something else happened. Her focus shifted toward maintaining it, fixing it, holding it together. Because losing the relationship didn't just mean losing the person. It meant losing that anchor, losing that structure, losing that sense of stability that helped her manage her internal world. So even when she felt dissatisfied, even when she noticed things weren't working, she stayed, not out of denial, but out of necessity. At least that's how it felt, because the relationship was doing something important. It was regulating her, helping her avoid that unstructured internal space that felt so uncomfortable to face alone. And the more she relied on that, the harder it became to imagine functioning without it. It's like leaning on something for a long time. At first it supports, then slowly, it becomes something you don't feel stable without, even if it wasn't meant to carry that weight, even if it wasn't strong enough to truly support you healthily. And that's where things get complicated. Because from the outside, it might look like an attachment to a person, but in reality, it's attachment to what the relationship provides internally. The feeling of not being alone, the feeling of having something to return to, the feeling of not having to face everything on your own. And when that's the case, you don't just fear losing the relationship, you fear losing yourself without it. You fear what happens when there's nothing external to organize your thoughts, your emotions, your time, So you adapt, you compromise, you overlook, you adjust your expectations, sometimes without even realizing it. Because maintaining the connection feels more important than questioning it, more important than asking, is this actually right for me? Because that question opens a door, and behind that door is the possibility of being alone again. And if being alone still feels like instability, you'll do almost anything to avoid going back there, even if it means staying somewhere that doesn't fully meet you, that doesn't fully see you, that doesn't fully support you, because at least it gives you something predictable, something familiar, something that keeps that deeper discomfort just far enough away. And as long as that dynamic stays in place, relationships won't feel like a choice. They'll feel like they need, like something required to stay emotionally balanced. And when something feels like a need, walking away from it feels almost impossible. Part 4, a past where aloneness felt uncertain. To really understand why this pattern felt so strong, we had to go back, not to analyze every detail, not to blame, but to notice where this feeling first started to take shape. Because these reactions don't appear out of nowhere. They've learned, slowly, quietly, over time. Clara grew up in an environment where presence wasn't always consistent. People were there, physically, but emotionally, it wasn't always predictable. There were moments of closeness, warmth, attention, times when she felt seen, safe, connected. But those moments didn't always last. They could shift without warning. Fa'ahas, sometimes the attention faded, sometimes the mood changed, sometimes the connection felt distant, even when nothing obvious had happened. And as a child, that kind of inconsistency is hard to understand. You don't think, this is just how adults are. You don't analyze patterns. You feel them. You experience them directly. And your system starts trying to make sense of it. So in those moments of closeness, she relaxed. She felt grounded, like everything was okay. But when that closeness disappeared, even slightly, something else showed up. Uncertainty, a quiet tension, a question she couldn't fully form yet. Did something change? Did I do something wrong? Why does this feel different now? And when those questions don't get clear answers, the mind doesn't just let them go. It adapts. It starts to create its own rules, subtle ones, unspoken ones, rules like connection isn't stable. Closeness can disappear. If I want it to stay, I have to maintain it. So she learned to pay attention, to notice small shifts, to adjust her behavior, to stay close, to avoid distance, not consciously, not as a strategy she chose, but as a natural response. Because for a child, connection equals safety. And when that safety feels uncertain, you do what you can to protect it, even if that means becoming more aware of others than of yourself, more focused on maintaining the connection than questioning whether it feels good. And over time, this becomes familiar, normal, expected. Being with someone feels regulating because it mirrors those early moments of closeness. It brings that sense of, I'm okay, I'm connected, I'm not alone. But being alone feels different, not necessarily painful in an obvious way, but uncertain, undefined, like something is missing, like the conditions for safety aren't fully there. And even if nothing is actually wrong, the feeling remains, because it was never just about the present. It was shaped in the past, in those small, repeated experiences where presence came and went, where closeness wasn't always steady, where connection felt valuable but not guaranteed. So as an adult, she didn't just seek relationships, she sought stability through them. She sought consistency, predictability, something she could rely on, something that wouldn't suddenly shift or disappear. And when she found that, even imperfectly, it felt important to hold on to, because it wasn't just about the person. It was about what the connection represented, a sense of grounding, a sense of safety, a sense of not having to navigate everything alone. And that's why letting go felt so difficult. Not because she didn't see the reality of the relationship, but because, on a deeper level, it was connected to something much older. A learned association. Being with someone equals safety. Being alone equals uncertainty. And until that association is seen clearly and slowly redefined, the pattern tends to repeat. Not because someone wants it to, but because it feels familiar, and familiar often feels safer than the unknown, even when it isn't. Part 5. Why her system associated aloneness with risk. By the time Clara reached adulthood, her life looked very different from her childhood. She had independence, control, freedom to make her own choices. On the surface, being alone was no longer dangerous. There was no real threat, no actual instability, but her nervous system didn't update that quickly, because the body doesn't respond to logic first. It responds to patterns, to what it has learned over time. And for years, her system had been quietly learning something. Aloneness feels uncertain. Uncertainty feels unsafe. So even when her mind understood that being alone was completely fine, her internal response said something else. It created a signal. Subtle at first, a slight discomfort, a restlessness, a need to reach for something or someone. And that signal wasn't random. It was protective. It was her system trying to guide her back toward what it recognized as stability, back toward connection, back toward presence. Because of her presence and her experience meant things were okay. So when that presence disappeared, even temporarily, her system reacted, and not with clear thoughts, but with sensations, a feeling in her chest, a tension in her body, a quiet urgency she couldn't fully explain. And that's the tricky part, because when something feels physical, it feels real, immediate, important. So instead of questioning it, she responded to it. She reached out. She stayed connected. She avoided being alone for too long. Not because she consciously believed she couldn't handle it, but because her body was telling her otherwise. And over time, this created a loop. The discomfort of being alone pushed her toward relationships. Relationships reduced that discomfort, at least temporarily, which reinforced the idea that connection was the solution. So the pattern continued, even when the relationship wasn't fulfilling, even when it wasn't aligned, even when a part of her knew it wasn't what she truly wanted. Because the goal wasn't just happiness, it was a regulation. It was reducing that internal signal that said, something isn't right. And as long as being alone triggered that signal, she would keep moving toward connection, any connection, because something felt better than nothing, even if that something came with a compromise, even if it required her to ignore certain needs, because at least it kept that deeper discomfort at a manageable distance. And that's why change didn't start by forcing herself to leave. It started with understanding what her system was actually reacting to. Not the present moment, but a learned association, a connection between aloneness and risk. And once that became clear, something important shifted. Because what feels like truth, it is sometimes just memory. Part Part 6. The moment she faced the fear directly. The turning point didn't come from a big decision. It didn't start with her ending the relationship. It started with something much smaller, much quieter. She chose to spend time alone, on purpose, not because she had to, not because there was no other option, but because she wanted to understand what actually happened in that space. At first, it was uncomfortable, more than she expected. Silence didn't feel peaceful, it felt loud. Time didn't feel open, it felt slow. Every minute stretched. Every thought felt closer, more noticeable, harder to ignore. There was a strong pull to distract herself, to check her phone, to message someone, to fill the space quickly. But this time, she didn't. She stayed. Not perfectly, not without resistance, but intentionally. And something interesting happened. The discomfort she expected to grow didn't. It changed. At first, it felt like a wave, rising, uncomfortable, uncertain. But then, it leveled out. It didn't disappear completely, but it became clearer, less overwhelming, more specific. Instead of a vague sense of something is wrong, she could actually notice what she was feeling. Restlessness, a bit of anxiety, a habit of reaching outward. Things that before felt like one big undefined experience now had shape. And when something has shape, it becomes easier to sit with, easier to understand, easier to move through. She began to realize that the fear wasn't endless. It wasn't something that would keep growing forever. It had a limit, a rhythm, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that changed everything. Because what she feared most was being trapped in that feeling. But now she could see. It passed. Slowly, but it did. And the more she stayed with it, the more familiar it became. Less like a threat, more like an experience. Something she could observe instead of escape. And for the first time, being alone didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she could learn from. Part 7. Learning that aloneness is not abandonment. Over time, something subtle began to shift. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Clara started to experience aloneness differently. At first, it was still unfamiliar, still a bit uncomfortable, but it wasn't as overwhelming. It didn't carry the same weight, the same urgency, the same need to escape. What once felt like absence started to feel like space, open, quiet, not empty in a negative way, but available. She began to notice things she hadn't before, her own thoughts, without rushing to change them, her emotions, without needing to fix them immediately, her preferences, her pace, her natural rhythm, without adapting to someone else's. And at first, this felt strange, because she wasn't used to it. She wasn't used to being with herself without adjusting, without performing, without responding. But slowly, that space became neutral, and then something more. It became grounded, a place where she could return to, not something to avoid, but something to rely on. And that's when the meaning of aloneness changed. It was no longer connected to abandonment. It was no longer a signal that something was missing. It became a different kind of presence, her own. And when that shift happened, relationships started to feel different too. Less like something she needed to stay stable, and more like something she could choose from a place of stability. Closing 22:40 to 24:30. Months later, she said something simple, but it carried a lot of weight. I don't rush into relationships anymore. I choose them. And that difference changes everything. Some people don't stay in the wrong relationships because they don't see the problem. They see it. They feel it. But leaving feels like losing stability itself, like stepping into something they're not sure they can handle, so they stay. Not for love, not for happiness, but for relief. Relief from what being alone brings up. But healing, it's not about rejecting connection. It's not about forcing yourself to be alone. It's about discovering something deeper. That being alone, it is not the same as being abandoned. That your presence, it can be enough to hold you. And when that becomes real, not just understood, but felt, everything shifts. Because when you can stand in your own presence without needing to escape it, relationships stop being something you depend on to feel okay and become something you choose to share